In 1915, Manitoba's government relented and introduced a bill to give women the vote in the next Manitoba provincial election. Beynon was elated, but she quickly noted that something was missing. Women were being given the right to vote in provincial elections, but they were not being given the right to be candidates. Beynon jumped into action. She pushed her colleagues in the Manitoba Grain Growers Society to threaten to withdraw their support from the ruling Liberals unless women were given both the right to vote and the right to be candidates. Hi, and welcome to episode 4 of season 1 of Social Democrats of the North, presented by the Broadbent Institute's Perspectives Journal podcast. I'm your host, Dave McGrane, a professor of political science at St. Thomas More College at the University of Saskatchewan, and member of the Perspectives Journal editorial committee. From Confederation to the Quiet Revolution, Social Democrats of the North takes you on a journey through history to discover the lives and the ideas of the leaders who have shaped Canadian social democracy, to give you the opportunity to learn about what social democracy has contributed to Canadian history. Plus, I want to provide you with some lessons for your own activism. In our last episode, I looked at Olivier Asselin, a radical journalist from Quebec who mixed the ideas of social democracy with ideas of French-Canadian nationalism. In this episode, I will examine another important part of early Canadian social democracy, the feminist movement, by diving into the story of a woman who challenged not just the economic order of her time, but the very structure of family life and gender roles on the Canadian prairies. Her name, Frances Marion Beynon. She was a journalist, activist, and feminist firebrand. Beynon was born to a farming family of 3 girls and 3 boys in Ontario in 1884. When she was 6 years old, her family moved to Harding, Manitoba to start a new farm there. From a very young age, it was clear that Beynon's most striking quality was that she wanted to think for herself. She refused to accept the status quo just because that was the way that things had always been done. However, a small farming community on the prairies was not an inviting place for a woman who was independent and rebellious. From early on in her life, Beynon was made very aware that there was an expectation that she would marry a local farmer and become a farm wife. It was expected that she would clean the house, cook the food, raise the children, and obey all the commands of her husband. Her teachers, neighbors, and the members of her church all pushed her in that direction. Moreover, her parents were extremely religious and very traditional. They did everything they could to encourage her to marry at a young age and to become a farm wife who had lots of children and went to church every Sunday. In her autobiographical novel, written later in her life, Beynon wrote the following passage that evidently applies to her own childhood. The novel's main character, a young girl living on a farm in Manitoba, says the following: "I think I was born to be free, but my parents, with God as one of their chief instruments of terror, frightened me into servility." Beynon was able to escape her fate to become a farm wife for a while by teaching at a local one-room school. But by 1908, the pressure to conform and do what everyone else thought that she should do had become too much. So Beynon made a dramatic decision. Along with her sister Lillian, she left the small farming community where she had lived all of her life and moved to the big city, Winnipeg. She didn't know much about Winnipeg, and she didn't know anybody who lived there. But she hoped there was a place where she could finally be free to think for herself. Despite having few contacts, Beynon was able to find employment writing advertisements for women's clothing and women's products at the Eden Company department store. It was at this job that she discovered her passion for writing and decided to pursue a career in journalism. In the early 1900s in Canada, women writing in newspapers were confined to what was known as the women's page. The women's page concentrated on so-called women's issues, such as cooking, cleaning, and raising children. Still, women's pages were an opportunity for women's writing to be published to a larger audience and for women's voices to be heard in their society. In 1912, Beynon got her big break in journalism, and she was hired to be the editor of the women's page of the Grain Growers Guide. The Grain Growers Guide was an extremely popular magazine that was subscribed to by nearly every farming family across the Canadian prairies in the early 1900s. It was the main organ of the radical farmers movement and was jointly published by the 3 grain grower associations of the prairies. That is, the Saskatchewan Grain Grower Association, the Alberta Grain Grower Association, and the Manitoba Grain Grower Association. As we will learn about more in future episodes, these grain grower associations held what was often considered at the time to be radical social democratic ideas. They talked about things like government ownership of important public utilities, higher taxes on the rich, and the need for social programs like Medicare and unemployment insurance. Beynon thought that she had finally found her place where she was free to be an independent thinker. She thought that she would finally have the opportunity to say what she really thought about Canadian society and to say what she really thought needed to be changed in Canadian society. Beynon immediately made the controversial decision to not just fill the women's page of the Grain Growers Guide with recipes and sewing tips. Instead, she turned it into a platform for political debate, economic analysis, and raw, honest stories from prairie women who often talked about how they were being mistreated by their husbands. It was during her editorship of the women's page of the Grain Growers Guide that Beynon made her biggest contribution in Canadian social democracy. Most social democrats during the time in which Beynon lived focused on the economic exploitation of male farmers and workers by male businessmen. They essentially ignored women and ignored the situation of women altogether. For them, social democracy was about one group of men exploiting another group of men. What Beynon did that was so innovative and revolutionary is that she looked inside of the home to see what exploitation was happening there. In her articles in the Grain Growers Guide, Beynon argued that farm wives were being exploited, not by owners of big corporations, but by their own husbands. On top of giving birth to and raising the children that were needed to provide labor for the farm, the duties of the farm wife include the following: performing all household cleaning, hauling water, gathering firewood, making clothes, preparing meals, tending to family food sources such as gardens, and generating additional income through the sale of handicrafts and produce. Under marriage laws at this time, men had exclusive control over all of the farm couple's property, and women had no control. Husbands' control over the couple's property even extended to the money that wives made through selling goods that they produced. Therefore, farm wives worked 12 hours a day over many years of their life, contributing considerably to the success of the farm. However, they were legally denied a share of the profit that their farm produced. Even when their husband died, the law was clear that the ownership of the farm would pass to the oldest son or immediate male relatives if there was no son. It was forbidden for the ownership of the farm to pass to the farmer's wife. Beynon denounced this situation of financial dependency of farm wives on their husbands, and she denounced the unjust situation that it produced. She argued that when women had no control over their finances, they had no control over their lives. Farm women's well-being was essentially at the whim of the generosity that they had to beg from their husbands. And farm women depended on their husbands to competently manage their family finances, which wasn't always the case. Beynon was especially angry at how the legal system for day allowed the domestic abuse of women and made divorce almost impossible for a woman to obtain. Often, women became trapped in abusive relationships, and Beynon noted that the law did more to protect the property of men than it did to protect the safety of women. But Beynon didn't just criticize. She imagined a better future. She called for the rise of the new man. According to Beynon, the new man wouldn't expect his wife to be his servant. He would invite her to manage their farm and household together as co-equals. And he would support legal reforms that would give women the right to vote and allow them to own their own property. He would even encourage his wife to work outside of the home and become educated to be a lawyer, a doctor, or a politician. Beynon told the female readers of the Grain Growers Guide to quietly protest the treatment of their husbands by leaving beds unmade and dishes unwashed and seeing how long it took their husbands to notice. She hoped that such small acts of protest around the home would make husbands appreciate the work of their wives more and would encourage husbands to remake themselves as new men. As we can see, Beynon was one of the first thinkers in Canada to fuse feminism with social democracy. And she was one of the first social democrats in Canada to point out that social justice was not only needed in the workplace, social justice also needed to happen inside of the home. At the same time that she was making waves as a feminist firebrand and the editor of the women's page of the Grain Growers Guide, Beynon was also starting to get involved in politics. In the early 1900s, women were not allowed to vote in any provincial elections or in federal elections either. Along with her fellow feminists, Beynon founded the Manitoba Political Equality League to fight for women's suffrage. The League held protests and presented numerous petitions to the Manitoba government. When that didn't work, they became more inventive with their tactics. They staged a satirical play called A Woman's Parliament. The play was set in a world in which women ruled and men were asking for the vote. It poked fun at all of the arguments that were being made by men who did not want women to be able to vote. In 1915, Manitoba's government relented and introduced a bill to give women the vote in the next Manitoba provincial election. Beynon was elated, but she quickly noted that something was missing. Women were being given the right to vote in provincial elections, but they were not being given the right to be candidates. Beynon jumped into action. She pushed her colleagues in the Manitoba Grain Growers Society to threaten to withdraw their support from the ruling Liberals unless women were given both the right to vote and the right to be candidates. It worked, and women in Manitoba became the first women in Canada to get the right to vote and the right to run in provincial elections. Beynon was becoming well-known in Winnipeg, and her political activism was beginning to make a real difference in her society. However, Beynon was living in very sexist times, and there was even sexism in the supposedly radical farmer movement in which she was working. Beynon's approach to allowing women to speak in their own voices and talk about their own issues eventually began to anger some of the male readers and male editors of the Grain Growers Guide. For instance, when she published several editorials in favor of giving women the right to vote and criticizing laws excluding women from owning property, a Grain Growers Guide reader, sarcastically referring to himself as another mere man, wrote back. He stated that women did not need to own property because, in his words, a man is forced to support his wife. What more does she want? Further, he told Beynon that women should not have the right to vote because he had never yet saw two that could agree. He informed Beynon that women's inability to agree with each other would bring total chaos to Canadian politics. Male readers like this were determined to snuff out the candle of Beynon's feminism before it could burn too bright. Eventually, the pressure on Beynon to tone down her radical feminist ideas started to mount. She ruffled the feathers of her male editors more when she took a stand against the conscription of young men to fight in World War I. She also spoke out against the changes to election laws that disenfranchised those who were born in Germany and other enemy countries from voting in elections in Canada. She started to face lots of blowback from readers, and her bosses started to criticize the positions that she was taking. But she refused to give up her journalistic independence, and she refused to compromise her freedom to think for herself. Eventually, she ended up resigning her editorship of the women's page of the Grain Growers Guide in 1917 under mysterious circumstances. It seems that she was not fired, but she was able to read the writing on the wall, and she realized that the Grain Growers Guide was not a hospitable place for her to speak her mind. Feeling rejected by the prairie farm organizations that she ardently supported, Beynon left Winnipeg to find work in the United States in 1918. Soon after arriving in the United States, she wrote Editorial. I read a passage from it at the beginning of the podcast. It is an autobiographical novel about a young feminist who leaves her small farming community to move to Winnipeg. In Winnipeg, this young feminist becomes involved in the labor movement, suffragist movement, and anti-war movement. It garnered little attention when it was published in 1919. It is now considered a classic of Canadian feminist literature. It appears that Beynon never really got over the rejection that she felt by the farmers' movement in Canada. She quietly retired from politics and did not do much more writing for the rest of her life. Rather, she worked the last 30 years of her life at a mission in the United States for retired sailors. In fact, she did not return back to Canada until 1950, a year before her death at the age of 67. Despite her relatively short journalistic and political career in Canada, Beynon made an important contribution to the history of our country. She played a pivotal role in ensuring that women received the vote in Manitoba, and soon other provinces and the federal government followed Manitoba's lead on this issue. She was also one of the first people to point out the sexism inherent in the agricultural economy of the Canadian prairies. And her ideas paved the way for future feminists to criticize the lack of financial independence given to women in Canada. Such criticisms eventually led to changes in Canadian law that allowed women to own property, allowed women to divorce when they're in abusive relationships, and allowed women to attain educational opportunities. Finally, her mixing of feminism with social democracy meant that feminism became an important part of social democracy in Canada. As you will see in future podcasts, feminism gradually becomes inseparable from social democracy in Canada. Therefore, due to the efforts of women like Beynon, it is now a very commonplace for social democrats in Canada to consider themselves to be feminists. There are definitely lessons for us in the life and the ideas of Frances Marion Beynon. As I've mentioned, her most striking quality was that she wanted to think for herself. She would not be forced to accept the status quo because that was the way that things had always been done. She was even brave enough to stand up to the men in the prairie farmer movement that called themselves radical, but still had very sexist ideas about women's role in society. The lesson for Canadian Social Democrats today is to not be afraid to stick to our guns. Frances Marion Beynon reminds us that real change often starts by asking uncomfortable questions. Those are questions about power, questions about privilege, and questions about what is generally accepted to be normal. There is always the justified fear that proposing new ideas and questioning the way that things have been done will scare off potential voters and supporters. So I don't think that we should pick our new ideas unwisely. But if we don't propose things that are different from the status quo, we're not that much different from liberals and conservatives. She was not afraid to present new and bold ideas to Canadians, and neither should we be. I'm Dave McGrane, and thanks for joining me on Social Democrats of the North, a Perspectives Journal podcast series produced by the Broadbent Institute. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share it with someone you know who loves Canadian political history. You can read more about social democracy in Perspectives Journal, a publication of the Broadbent Institute, by visiting perspectivesjournal.ca. Get more information on the work of the Broadbent Institute by subscribing to our mailing list at broadbentinstitute.ca/subscribe. Next time, we'll meet a social democratic leader who wasn't afraid to mix religion and politics and even preach that Jesus Christ was the first socialist. Until then, keep questioning the status quo and stay social democratic.